Hello friends, I'm Su. Today I'm going to talk about the difference between totalitarianism in the West and totalitarianism in the East. Firstly, I would like to quote from the Chinese historian Qian Mu's claim of the distinction between the feudalism in the West and the feudalism in China. He claims that feudalism in the West is a social form, is the shape of a society, when feudalism in China was a political system, was a political design imposed on the Chinese society from above. What does it mean by feudalism as a social form, as the shape of a society? It means people, it means society choose to voluntarily live in a feudalistic way of life, even when there is no official feudalistic system. There is no official feudalism. This fits very consistently with Michael Hutchison's claim that the financial capitalism in the West is just new feudalism. The relationship between the rentier class and the working class is just the same as that between the landlords and serfs in the medieval feudal times. The essence of this Western feudal relationship is master-slave relationship, as between absolute ownership and absolute subordination. This way of social forms, of social life, has always been there, no matter how their society changes, no matter if it was in the ancient Roman Empire or the 1,000 years medieval feudalistic times, or in the capitalism, or in the colonial area, or in today's financial capitalism. It's always there. This is why the hierarchical suppression has always existed in the West, no matter in the form of racial suppression or class suppression or other forms of suppression. Doesn't matter, because the Western social forms have always been feudalistic in its roots. On the other hand, the Chinese feudalism was a political design, only existed in Zhou dynasty from 11 to 8th century BC. This political design allocates certain regions of China to certain oligarchs, but also regulates that every land unit must be divided into 9 sections, 9 grids, and the central section is a public section that the farmers grow things together there, and the stuff grow there, go to oligarchs. But the 9 sections, but the 8 sections around that central section are the private lands of the farmers, and farmers grow their own stuff and bring harvesting to their own house, and it's their private property. And the oligarchs cannot claim the farmers' private land as the public land. The feudalistic Zhou dynasty doesn't regulate the suppressing relationship between farmers and oligarchs. Actually, this relationship only exists in Europe. Chinese in Zhou dynasty in general, no matter if you're farmers or oligarchs or king, actually live a quite free and virtuous life, actually. This distinction between the feudalism in the West and in China inspires me a lot, actually, because after a long time research, I finally realized that the similar thing can also be said about totalitarianism, about the distinction between the totalitarianism in the West and totalitarianism in the East, in China, to be specific. China has never come through totalitarian society in the 5,000 years history until recently, until the second half of 20th century, actually. But totalitarianism in the West has always been there throughout Western history. No matter if you have a totalitarian political system or not. Liberal democracy was not designed as a totalitarian political system. But Western people who live under liberal democracy choose to live in a totalitarian way anyway. They choose to form fascist groups, communist groups, socialist groups, whatever groups, and worship Bible-like manifestos and put disciplines and regulates their members in certain ways, and also perform certain way of collective life, and rejects people not from their groups, being hostile to people not from their groups. I somehow want to quote from Karl Joachim Friedrich again. He said in his totalitarian dictatorship that communism and fascism are deeply rooted in Christianity. Because Christianity is a totalitarian religion. Christianity itself is totalitarianism. And it's been there for 2,000 years. So people, the European people, who live under this religion, who live this religious life for 2,000 years, cannot imagine anything else. They are so used to the totalitarian way of life. You give them freedom, you give them liberal democracy, but they don't know how to use it. They don't know how to use it. They cannot handle it. It's like in the movie Shawshank's Redemption, people who live for their whole life in prison should not be released out of the prison, because when they get out of the prison, they are not used to the free world, actually. They either choose to go back to prison or commit suicide. That's why in the West, under liberal democracy, you see all the people live within different totalitarian groups, but all of them are totalitarian. And all their ideologies are the similar shit that all come from Christianity. Now let me talk about totalitarianism in China. Totalitarianism in China was imposed as a political design on Chinese society. The Chinese society itself never come through totalitarianism. Chinese people, have never lived through totalitarian way of life throughout 5,000 Chinese years history. China was conquered by the industrialized West in the 19th century, and any attempt it made to industrialize itself and defend itself against the West under the framework of traditional Chinese society failed. Only by bringing in the totalitarian framework did China successfully industrialize itself. And the price is high, but there were no other options. Actually, when Chairman Mao was young, he was a kind of empiricist, actually. He cares about the practical solutions, practical ways to solve problems, to save countries. He's not so obsessed with ideologies. But nobody took him seriously at the time. And all the intellectuals were kind of egoistic and looked down upon him, actually. Nobody took him seriously. And eventually he realized these practical ways wouldn't work, actually. He must adjust himself to the framework of communism. He must bring in communism. Only by bringing in communism can he save China. In my previous videos, I showed you how hard Chinese people struggled for agriculture, for industry, to develop themselves, to progress during the communist times, during the early communist times. That's part because Chinese society was not used to a politically totalitarian design. That's something very new to a traditional Chinese society. So it's destined to be a very bumpy road. So there's a big difference between totalitarianism as a social form and totalitarianism as an imposed political system. For China, it wouldn't need to choose this system if there were no Western invasion. But for the West, a totalitarian society is the only way of existence, no matter what. China was a self-containing civilization. It didn't need to invade other countries. It didn't need to expand itself. But the West has never come through any genuine civilization. The West is a barbarian slavery that constantly expands itself. It's a system of old slaves looking for new slaves to suppress. It's a black hole that eats up all the materials. And it's also like a Ponzi scheme. And eventually it explodes, like poof. Now I want to talk about the historical reason behind the differences I have been talking about today. The Chinese historian Qian Mu makes a distinction between two different cultural roots. One is what he calls race culture, race roots, and the other is surname culture, surname roots. And Chinese culture, even from 5,000 years ago, its agricultural culture belongs to surname culture, surname roots. What does it mean by surname roots? It means people's identity is binded with the land he grew up with, he grew food on. And people who live in the same area share the same surname. It's like a big family. And this surname is also the surname of the land, of the name of the land they live in. And in this culture, people treat the land, a certain area of land they live in, as kind of their mother, like mother. They have emotions for their land, for very specific land, not abstract concept of land like a country or something, no, but very specific land, like a few square, not a few square meter, but like tens or hundreds of square meters of lands where he lives in. This very specific area of land is his roots that he's connected with, and he must have a very harmonious relationship with this specific land, and also have a harmonious relationship with the people who live in the same land, who share the surname with him. That's why there's a traditional Chinese saying, the fallen leaves eventually go back to its roots. It means for traditional Chinese who have this surname culture, no matter where you travel in your life, you wouldn't leave your homeland. You will come back. You will come back to your homeland, to the land where you grew up with, and die there. It also makes Chinese people unwilling to invade other countries, invade other people's land, because that's not my land. That's not my life. That's not my surname. I don't belong there. In comparison, there's a race culture that typically happens to nomadic tribes. The nomadic tribes don't have fixed land. They ride on horses and travel everywhere. And if they are hungry and they find some animals to hunt, and they also go to agricultural areas to rob, to steal stuff, and to kill people, and then move to the next place. These are the typical features of nomadic tribes. When the nomadic tribes moves around to different places, the only thing that can keep their identity is the race, is the blood, is the racial blood. This is so important. This is why race is so fundamental, is so important for nomadic tribes. Actually, in China, about 2,700 years ago, there were big wars, big nationwide wars between the agricultural ethnicity and the nomadic ethnicity in China. And the nomadic ethnicity in China was called Rongdi, and the agricultural ethnicity in China was called Huaxia. And the result was the agricultural ethnicity won the war and defeated the nomadic tribes. And this has also become the foundation of the Chinese civilization. Chinese civilization is an agricultural civilization, a surname agricultural civilization. And the Chinese civilization in Chinese is called Huaxia civilization. Huaxia civilization. And Huaxia, like I said, was the name of the agricultural ethnicity 2,700 years ago in China. And they defeated the nomadic tribes, Rongdi. For me, it's so understandable that Europeans, especially Northern Europeans, hate Chinese. They hate Chinese. They are nomadic tribes. They are nomadic tribes. How can he not hate Chinese? Chinese agricultural civilization is an anti-nomadic civilization. We are enemies in nature. Some people may argue, they probably would say that there's also agriculture in Europe. How can you just call them nomadic tribes? Agriculture in Europe has always been serfdom. And I don't recognize serfdom as agricultural civilization. It's just a form of slavery. It's just an extension of nomadic tribes, actually. They don't have the natural human rights that give land for free to every citizen who reaches 18 years old, like in China. They don't have it. This only belongs to surname agricultural civilization. All the financial slavery in the West is about seizing land, is about manipulating land, and build slavery and usury based on that. But even when Chinese civilization was an agricultural civilization, it did have a very rich history of dealing with the nomadic tribes. The Huns, the Mongolians, the other nomadic tribes in the northern China, they harassed China all the time throughout Chinese history. They tried to conquer China all the time through Chinese history. And sometimes China get conquered in parts, and sometimes China retake some of the areas and defeated them. But war was just a kind of passive way for China to deal with the nomadic tribes in the north, because China never want war in the first place. But those nomadic tribes, they enjoy war. They enjoy it so much. Even when they get defeated, they still enjoy it. But what was the positive and initiative way to deal with these northern nomadic tribes for China then? The answer is to Hanize them, to Hanize these northern barbarians. Han refers to Chinese ethnicity. Chinese ethnicity is also called the Han, the so-called Han people, Han nationals. And to Hanize barbarians means to attract them by means of Chinese culture. And once the barbarians are attracted by Chinese culture, they start to learn Chinese culture by themselves. And if they start to learn Chinese culture by themselves, they will become Han Chinese step by step, and eventually become civilized by Chinese civilization. And this is a process of Hanizing, of Hanization. And of course, all the northern barbarians would show hostility, would reject Chinese culture in the beginning, and show a very strong contempt, actually, like what the Dutch do in our time, actually, like. But they are not 100% immune. They can always be penetrated. Today's China penetrates them with Chinese restaurants and Chinese products. Actually, everything they use is made in China. Because China had a very rich history of dealing with nomadic tribes, of dealing with barbarians, it has never been fully conquered by the West. It never comes through the same level of genocide by the West like the Aboriginal Americans did. That's also why I always have a question in my mind. What is the civilization of Maya, Inca, Aztec like in Aboriginal America? Was it agricultural civilization? It's probably agricultural civilization, but somehow it lacks the experience of dealing with these nomadic tribes, with nomadic barbarians. So it's not immune to this thing. And when this thing comes, they were just exterminated. They were just being exterminated. I don't trust in any English materials in Maya, Inca, Aztec. If I want to know any information, I would prefer it to be coming from the Latin Americans with Aboriginal blood, who are cultured, who still have some knowledge of their old civilization. There are many Europeans who have been to China, were very shocked and impressed by the Chinese civilization, because it's very different. It's even opposite to what their propaganda says. Some of them choose to stay in China and never want to go back to their homeland anymore. but some of them still choose to go back to their homeland and choose to be loyal to their racial tribes. And in many cases, they can even lie about China, even they have been to China, but what they see doesn't give them any sort of grace, but only gives them jealousy. They can't accept it. They would rather lie about China just to follow the Western propaganda. That's because for nomadic tribes, for racial tribes, loyalty is always above honesty. Loyalty is always above honesty. That's the case for the tribal culture. Actually, I once had a conversation with a Spanish friend, and he's been to China. He was so impressed by China. He loves China so much. According to him, even there's a political system in China he doesn't like. He somehow still feels a certain level of freedom, a very strong sense of freedom within Chinese people that he has never seen within Europeans. He also admitted to me that many Europeans, their senses are shut down. They are unable to use their sensual perception anymore. It's like certain part of their brain is closed, shut down. It doesn't work anymore. It becomes lamp. That they can only live on projections, the projections from certain propaganda or certain group authority, but their sensual feeling of the reality, their sensual perception, sensual connection that allows them to recognize facts and reality is gone. This is not a good feeling. This is torture, actually. This is a very inhuman torture. I feel sorry for these people. I feel sorry for these kind of Europeans so much, actually. We had a discussion on how and why this happened, and my conclusion was this happened when a concept is formed before you sense the real thing. For example, if you're European and you have never been to China in your life, and you have never had experience with Chinese people, and you just enter school and you've been told in your education book that China is like this, that, Chinese people are like this, that, blah, 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 blah. This is when a concept is shaped, is formed in your mind before your actually senses touch the real thing. This is a moment your mind gets fucked, actually. It's also like nowadays that many kids use iPad. They see many things on iPad, like animals, earth, sky, many things. But if your first conceptualization of the objects is from the iPad rather than the real thing you see and you touch, you would never be able to form the proper sensual concept in your mind. And if this kind of thing happen all the time in your life, and eventually your mind sense become dead. Your sense is dead, and you become like Eichmann, or much worse than him, actually, much worse. And then you will, then you have to live on drugs, actually. The totalitarian way of social life is a sign of lack of culture and civilization. And in the West, this way of life is deeply rooted in Christianity and is combined with the Western racial tribal identity. But China as a culture and a civilization never needed totalitarianism in the 5,000 years history until recently in the last century, in order to prevent themselves from being exterminated. The British philosopher Russell once visited China and was so shocked and impressed by the freedom he witnessed in China. And he said, wow, there's no concept of nation in this country. I don't see nation in this country. And he said this in the sense of a nation state, which is normally combined with races established after Westphalia War in Europe. Okay guys, I stop for today. Thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you next time. Bye.